Hey everyone, it's James here from the DevGenie Academy, and this week we'll be taking a step forward as we begin to develop our engine a little bit more. And with experimenting with this engine, you will find that some entities just don't look quite right. So here's an example I've set up here. As you can see, the trees are rendered here fine, but this object here, this fern, it just doesn't look quite right. You can see that it's sort of transparent in areas, and this is because if we go into our window manager, we still have a setting applied from pretty much the first episode, and that's the cull face of the back face of the object. So if we comment that out and rerun our application, we can see the ferns are actually rendered okay now. They're not bad. But the problem with this is if we go inside of an object such as the tree, or we go underneath the terrain, everything underneath where the player would never really see, wasting rendering time, we're actually rendering that now, so we don't really want to do that. What we want to do is we want to say we only want to stop culling the back face of that fern. So again, he's inside of the tree, it's all rendered. So to remedy this, what we're going to do is we're going to implement object transparency. So this is fairly easy to implement. So first of all, if we go into the material class, we can add a new boolean in here, and we can just call that disable culling. So that way we can say what object we want to disable the culling on, and what object we don't. By default, the disable culling will be turned off, so we're just disabling the culling, we're enabling the culling as normal, and we just need a getter and setter for that. There we go, and then we can apply that only to our fern. So in the render manager, we need a way of implementing that. So we need a few more variables in the render manager. First of all is culling, so we can determine whether we are culling at that point or whether we're not. Again, by default, we don't want that to be culling anything. Next up, we need a way of enabling the backface culling and also a way of disabling the backface culling. So we can create two functions here, one just to enable it, which is pretty much what we've already done in Window Manager, and one to disable it. Disable culling and enable culling is what we'll call them. So like I said, it's pretty much what we've already done in the Window Manager, but what we can do instead of this, so we're not redoing it each and every time, is if we already culling, and I need to make that variable static. Yeah, it needs to be static. Yeah, it's culling. Private static. There we go. So if we aren't culling inside of the enable, then we can do GL11 enable, GL cull face, and then obviously we cull the back face. So it's fairly straightforward. So remember, it's GL11 that we're doing on this one. We basically do the reverse of this in the disable culling. So if we are culling, then we can then disable it again. So GL11 GL disable for this one, and it's GL11 GL cull face, and then just set these culling back to false. So by setting up the culling in this way inside of the render manager, what we can do is we can utilize those two functions when we're looping through our list of entities. So as you can see here in the bind method of the entity renderer, we can check at this point to see if the model's material has the disable culling attribute turned on. If it does, then we can call disable culling, or if it is turned on, we can then call enable culling. So it's just, if it is disable culling, we disable it. If it isn't, we can just enable it. And all we need to do now is in our init method where we declare the model, we can then just say model, it's model.getMaterial.set disable culling to true. So that way the model's being disabled, but everything else is still the same. And if we turn that back on in our window manager and run that now, we should be able to see that the fern is indeed being textured, and it's the culling has been disabled on that object. But if we look around in the scene, actually the terrain is still being rendered there, so we need to also go back into the terrain render for this. And in the terrain renderer, if I can find it, where's the terrain renderer? There it is. So in the terrain renderer, in the bind method, we can just straight up call rendermanager.enable culling on that one, not disable, enable. There we go. And that will then stop the terrain from rendering on the back face. So again, the fern's still all good. And we can get right up inside of that, and now we don't see anything, and there we go. And the terrain now is not rendering when we're underneath it. And this tree should be the same. There we go. It just disappears when we go inside of it. So that's going to be it for this episode. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.